So my question is, how did we get to a situation where our entire religious expression in officialdom is Episcopalian, a declining, far left, marginalized denomination?
Well, those first two
is starting to hack me off.
have a reason. They're declining
they're connected
because
to the other
they're far
one.
left. Yeah.
Right.
Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley in Context. And if you didn't watch our last episode, you won't know our guest, but I encourage you to go back and watch my interview with Stephen Mansfield. We talked about the election. We talked to Stephen before the election, and this was kind of a post-mortem on the Trump election. And I wanted to continue talking to Stephen because, well, let's just say he's got a little bit of a bug in his bonnet. He did a podcast that was called A Modest Proposal regarding religion, and really it was more of a rant.
Absolutely.
It was a sanctified rant.
Absolutely.
But you were a little upset about the Episcopal Church in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me set this up. We have basically two churches identified with our national life. And anybody who pays attention to the religious ceremonies in Washington, D.C. knows this.
Whether they know it or not, they've seen pictures of it. Yeah.
There's St. John's, Church of the Presidents, across Lafayette Park from the White House. A church, by the way, that I think is beautiful.
It is
I've
gorgeous,
actually led tours there and attended events there. And normally inaugural church services are held there.
Right.
And then there's the National Cathedral, which most people probably assume, the U.S. government owns. But no, the Episcopal Church owns both. Now, let me give one caveat right up front. I have dear friends who are Episcopal priests. They're conservatives. They see themselves as change agents, and then they're trying to fight the good fight in a denomination that has drifted far left. Basically, theologically, the Episcopal Church is about making the sign of the cross over American secular culture. Okay.
You're being generous.
I'm trying to be kind. We can come back to some of the details of that. I mean, they've had a gay bishop and
Bishop Spong. We were trying to think of the dates on that, but that was a long time ago.
Yeah. And he couldn't be further left. And you remember Francis Schaeffer said that basically this is the kind of denomination that's humanism and theological garb, and there could not be a denomination of which this is more true. My problem. And we saw an outworking of this just recently at a prayer service the day after the inauguration. My problem is that since the Episcopal Church owns both of these churches, these church buildings, and runs the ceremonies that we have a small liberal denomination, only 1.6 million people. We can compare that to other denominations.
And it's diminishing.
And it's diminishing rapidly.
Yep.
Controlled by, in this case today, one woman, who is the Bishop of D.C., over 40,000 Episcopalians. But because of the amplification that she gets and the Episcopal Church gets, because our national government events are held at these churches, their message, their theology is dramatically amplified. So you want me to say, what's lit you up here recently, Stephen? I'm going to answer that question doing both sides of the interview because I'm so ticked off. So the day after the inauguration, Bishop Marianne Budde, B-U-D-D-E. I'm not being sarcastic by saying that.
Let me read what she said.
I would love for you to pitch in.
Let me read what she said. This was toward the end of her comments to President Trump. Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. And as you told the nation yesterday, you felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people and our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. And the people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meat packing plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals. We'll leave it right there.
Well, now I have to say, to be fair, that the back end of that was at least within the pale of biblical ethics.
No debate.
We care about the underclass. We care about the underprivileged, etc. But let's just pause for a moment. If I may completely dominate just for a moment. Trans children is who we're advocating for. What does that mean?
Yeah.
That means children who are being pressured, encouraged, allowed to ponder biologically changing their gender. And we already know what we believe about the LGBTQ agenda. So that comes up at that moment. Now, we can talk about all kinds of other changes.
Let me just inject. Budde has got a history.
No question.
That's pretty mild. If you go look at some of her earlier comments about Trump and the first administration,
she's way left.
She's very left, and she was very unkind, more so. And that comment was a little bit toned down in some respects.
Well, and it's an assassination. It's stealth. She's not there to do that. The president's sitting on the front row, Catholic vice president sitting right next to him, and she launches into them. Well, okay, so even if you say she has the right to do that because she's the Bishop of Washington and she owns the National Cathedral and she owns St. John's, here's my problem. Because they own those two buildings and we insist on having our religious services there, their theology is amplified. But there are only 1.6 million Episcopalians in America. Heck, there are 7 million Mormons. There are 13 million Southern Baptists. There's 52 million Roman Catholics. And The Economist tells us, famous Economist magazine out of London, tells us there are 100 million evangelicals. So my question is, how did we get to a situation where our entire religious expression in officialdom is Episcopalian, a declining, far left, marginalized denomination?
Well, those first two
are starting to hack me off.
Have a reason. They're declining.
They're connected
because
to the
they're
other
far
one.
left. Yeah.
Right.
There was a book written. The name escapes me, but the author. But it was a study called "Why Conservative Churches Are Growing." Not conservative the way we use that language.
Right.
It was about strict churches with strict doctrinal statements. I think it was in the 1960s.
Adhering to their moorings. Sure.
It was a big study across denominations. They set the Mormons aside in this study because they said that's a different system. But they said if you look at, in those days, the Catholic Church, the Baptist churches that were very clear about doctrine, those churches grew.
Absolutely.
Because you go, okay, this is what you believe, I'm with you.
Right.
But you try to be all things to all people, and that's what happened to the Episcopalians.
Well, and it's an accident of history, as you know, because a huge portion of the American colonists were Anglican.
Yeah.
The Episcopal Church arose as an American version of Anglicanism after the Revolution. It was conservative. It still adhered to its biblical moorings. And the leadership class was, for the most part, this kind of Anglican, but now Episcopalian. 3/4 of the signers of the Declaration were Episcopalians, or would have been Anglican at the time, and 5 minutes later they were going to be Episcopalians. So that's continued to American history. All of the religious services that we've had at a national level looked Episcopalian if they weren't Roman Catholic, let's say in the Kennedy era. And so it's understandable why officialdom kind of got wrapped up with the Episcopal Church. But that day has got to come to an end. Look, I'm a guy who loves history and heritage and tradition, but this has outlasted its reach. This has gotten ridiculous. And I think Mary Ann Budde sounded the death knell, what should be the death knell of this level of control. Where is the honor for evangelicals? Where is the honor for Roman Catholics? But we've talked in previous podcasts about how many people in Congress are Roman Catholic and how outspoken they are about social justice and pro-life issues. Why aren't they honored? 52 million, many times more than Episcopalians. So through an accident of history, a little bit of control, we've handed control of our national religious ceremonies to a very extreme. And by the way, I love the National Cathedral. Bev and I go
it's a gorgeous
to the
facility.
Performance of the Messiah every year at Christmas.
I've
spoken there. We love it. But Mary Ann Budde has changed out the windows. Mary Ann, to do weird kind of poster kinds of things. She's had things put in the architecture, quotes from people you and I wouldn't consider should have any words posted inside of a Bible-believing Christian church.
The removal of the stained glass was almost cartoonish.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
Because this overreach of all things Confederate, all things that had to do with any slave owner.
Right.
Which I understand some of the logic, but I also go, wait, use it as an opportunity to teach history.
Yeah.
Don't tear down the statue of Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson. Use it as an opportunity to say, this is what was happening in our country.
Exactly.
We fought a war. The South said northern aggression. The North said, wait, you can't have slaves.
Right.
And we had Lincoln in the middle of teach history.
Teach it.
Don't take the billboard down and say it never happened.
And then put up something that looks like a sophomore in high school sketched it out on a Saturday morning.
Don't be mean to sophomores.
I love sophomores. I'm just saying that shouldn't be in the National Cathedral, for heaven's sakes.
Well, some are pretty talented. So we have friends that are Anglican, and you made some pretty quick statements there.
Sure.
But Anglicanism today in the United States would be far more Protestant and evangelical than Episcopalians.
Well, let me pause real quick and say, if you ask me, as you have in times past, where are you on the denominational scale? You know what I believe biblically. I would have to say I'm a charismatic Anglican. That's probably the best description of Stephen Mansfield. Reformed, evangelical. I'm a George Whitefield guy, right? In that sense. So I certainly understand that what now is called Anglicanism in America is more Celtic, more Reformed, more evangelical. And of course, big fights being had over the property because they're all separating from Episcopal churches because the Episcopal denomination's gone nuts. And yet, inadvertently, we're enshrining the Episcopal Church as our official state church.
Oh, no, it is enshrined.
Well, and so, but notice the words I just said.
Yeah, I heard.
Listen up, ACLU. Why aren't you listening? As our official state church. So it's bigotry against all the other large denominations that need to be represented. And it's also, actually, I think, to some degree, a violation of the First Amendment. So all that to say, why don't we have it at the stinking convention center? Why don't we move it into some other neutral space?
Or what about this novel idea? National Cathedral is the host church, but you follow the nomination of the incoming president.
Well,
is that too
I would
complicated?
be in favor of that, but that would be like me saying, I'm Anglican, I want to have it in a Roman Catholic church. They would say, well, I'm sorry, this is a Catholic church. Did you not understand? Did you not see the sign? And that's what's happened at the National Cathedral. Because I've actually been involved in another context in trying to have a bit more evangelical event at the National Cathedral. Well, it's Episcopalian. They're not going to let go of that control. And we weren't wanting to handle rattlesnakes or throw things around. We just wanted to,
Fair point.
We just wanted to get it going there and do a thing. And but because it's Episcopalian, they're like, well, no, we're Episcopalian, and we'll have to be the clergy in charge. So I'm not denying them right over their own property. I'm just wondering how it became second to the White House in popularity.
Well, St. John's you get because of proximity,
of course.
And we've had lots of presidents that make their, that's where they go to church.
Right.
It tends to be more of a publicity.
Yeah.
Photo op. I went to church on Sunday. I carried my Bible, whatever.
It actually gets in the way of the congregation. I have friends like you probably do in that congregation. They're like, would you guys go somewhere else? We're trying to worship Jesus here.
Well, when we lived in Nova, D.C., occasionally you have someone come and magnetometers,
it just disrupts
dogs,
the whole
Secret
thing.
Service, whole thing. So it almost seems like the incoming administration should say, and some of our former have done this, they bring in, because you have the Indian Treaty Room, you have all kinds of rooms where you can have a church service in the 17 acres, and say, hey, I'm going to be here Sunday at 8 o'clock. Come in, have a little choir, bring in a youth choir from D.C. Here's a rotating list, like a Devo almost, and have a church service, a lot less disruptive.
Well, yes, exactly. And at the National Cathedral, the congregation feels exactly that way. Do you know the congregation meets in a little chapel in the back?
Because they don't fill up the room.
Because it's a tourist situation. Because they have to defer to officialdom. And I love the idea that there's any connection at all between our government and certain churches and institutions. But this has just gone to the extreme edge, and it's time for us to recognize that. I think right now, if you asked Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, would you have this ceremony again the day after the inauguration? They would have said, no, we're going to move this to
they
would have moved it somewhere else. They would have wanted the event. They wanted to begin, this is what's great about them and others, they wanted to begin their administration with prayer. The day after the inauguration and the dancing and the champagne drinking, let's get up the next morning and go ask God's blessing. Great. And then they get smacked by somebody who's urging care for trans children, which I'm in favor of caring for all children, in part by not trying to help them be trans.
Not chemically ruining them for their... So you used a phrase several times in your podcast, speaking truth to power.
Yes.
That cuts two ways with Michael Easley's head.
Sure.
Part of it feels like that's the most presumptuous thing you can say. So explain what you mean by that. Of course. And,
Yeah. Well, people in your audience would have to know that I spend a great deal of time sitting in the offices, presidents, prime ministers, elected officials, and so on, just what I end up doing worldwide. It's not that I'm anything impressive. And many times I'm helping them discern what's the righteous thing to do. Many times they're already Christians, or if they're not, what do you as a Christian believe I ought to do? I'm being asked by a Muslim, head or something of that nature. And I am there to try to speak the best I understand of God's truth into their life. They're open. Sometimes it's a rebuke. I have a few times sat with people who are doing evil in their society. They're trying to exterminate a certain tribe. Yeah. They've gone nuts. And I just happened to have an opportunity to sit with them and say, please, sir, I beg you, please hear me on this. You are in power. etc. You understand the kind of conversation we might have had. I'm not going to repeat them. But my point is that I'm not saying that I arrogantly know down to the letter God's will and I'm instantly confronting every elected official with it. But I do believe that we should. And as you know, because you've heard my podcast, that what I'm going after are those who have been bought off, those who got invited to White House dinners, those who
Nixon perfected that.
He sure did. He knew how to buy them. And Eisenhower talked about it too, by the way. When there's an actual quote from Eisenhower, it's a transcript, where he said, let's find out more about this Billy Graham. We can probably use him. So I'm not saying Billy Graham was bought off, but I know people who are friends of mine. I think they've been bought off. They got a photo op. They got invited to a White House dinner. Maybe they had a few moments conversation, and they are in. This guy can do no wrong. Yep. Well, that's idolatry. And Jonah 2:8, those who cling to idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. So I'm concerned about those who won't speak truth to power because they're looking forward to getting invited.
But what I want to differentiate is a conversation. If I was invited to the OAB, right. If I was invited to a White House gathering of pastors, right. Versus I'm in a pulpit and I've got an audience member, right. A congregant sitting there, and I'm speaking truth to power.
No. Never have I jumped up in the middle of a dinner. Never have I taken occasion where.
Well, no, not even that so much, Stephen. But what Buddy did. She spoke truth to power. She even said that in her NPR interview.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to lose the phrase "speaking truth to power."
That's what I'm saying.
That's what you and I both believe we're called to do, and we've done it.
But we do it in a way, in the right. I mean, if I've got a friend, and I've done this with not too long ago with a pastor in Chicago, the three of us meeting, and we were speaking truth to a guy that was doing some unfortunate things.
Yeah.
He didn't like it.
Yeah, sure.
I was with a guy like you.
Right.
We were like lovingly confronting him, saying, "Buddy, this is wrong. I'm speaking truth, but I'm not in a bully pulpit,
right?
With no decorum."
Yeah, I'm talking about speaking truth to power where you're asked, where you've got the platform, where I don't even mind saying polite. I mean, I'm willing to be unpolite like the Old Testament prophets if I have to be. You know very well I can be.
You tell me to shut up quite often when we're in the conversation.
You're one of my favorite people. You're one of my favorite people.
No, you do.
I do not. But I try to be polite and gracious, and that's frankly why I get invited back sometimes, because I'm not the wild hair, prophet type. But I do think you have to be willing to risk. Look, Mike, I adore you, but I'm willing to risk our relationship if you go nuts and I have to come correct you, or you have to correct me. If not, we're in some kind of idolatry of relationship that keeps us from speaking the truth of God. I'm certainly going to do that with those who have power to change the entire country. But that's not on my business card. That's not what I'm trying to do. I just want to speak truth where I have the opportunity. I'm concerned that while she thought she was speaking truth to power, she was out of the reach of biblical truth. Number one, she was far removed.
Well, let's pause. Her framework is not a biblical theology framework.
Right.
Her framework is some kind of inclusive worldview, accommodation.
Right.
It's, and that's back to your point about the Episcopal Church versus an Anglican.
Yeah. If I have opportunity with President Trump, and he asks me anything about what I think about his policies, or if there's just a casual, friendly moment where I can say, "Sir, how's your relationship with God? I know you have one. How are you feeling like that flows through your life and maybe guides your actions?" I've asked that kind of question many, many times. I will. But my point is that's because I care about the guy's soul. To do it as a hit job in front of the international media on an unbiblical topic is what Marianne Buddy is specializing in. And I think it's got to stop.
So in any pundit who puts reverend in front of their name gets on and eviscerates a candidate or the current president, a president running, speaking truth to power?
I know. Okay. It's not necessarily speaking truth to power.
But that's when I hear the phrase, and I appreciate your clarification. When I hear that phrase, that's what I hear and see. When I flip through
a bold, arrogant, I'm going to bust any ceremony and just get right in his face. No, that's presumption. That's presumption. And it does more damage than good. Even for her own cause, Marianne Buddy harmed her cause the other day. Now, I'm kind of glad she did because I'm not with her cause. But you can be sure that Donald Trump's rethinking anything else at the National Cathedral. You can certainly be sure.
Oh, there's no rethinking.
J.D. Vance is done.
It's been decided.
Yeah, you blew it. And by the way, are those, I mean, again, I understand she's extreme liberal and I don't agree with anything she urged except for the care for the poor. But But are those the most important issues in Donald Trump's life?
Oh, by the way, the $53 million in change that she helped through these, channeling these funds.
Right.
So there's a lot more, you could say she was bought in some respects
I think
for her own position.
Yeah, I think she is. Yeah, I think she is.
So.
And let's lay aside whether women should be clergy or not. The fact is that this woman is on the extreme edge. But I'm concerned, where were the other voices? Where are the other voices? See, this is, who are the most prominent clergy in our society today who are, you and I would consider biblical? Why aren't they there? Why aren't they speaking?
Well, this
Why
has always
aren't
been
they
my
praying?
question. When we lived up there and there were events, it's like, why do you bring in this person? Number one, geographical area. There's some great voices in Nova who could easily, in our time frame up there, Lon Solomon, John Yates, and Rob Norris, any of those people could drive to these things. And do a phenomenal job. But you bring in a superstar with a name.
And I'm not saying that just because you're on television that somehow you're automatically compromised. But we got to have more around the president than television preachers who come with a mailing list and a camera. One of the ways, you know this very well because you're very versed in
That's
DC.
That's a frightening thought, a mailing list and a camera. Boy.
Yeah. One of the reasons that I am gained some entree is that I have chosen, this is going to sound terrible.
No, you stay out of the.
I've chosen not to be in the limelight quite as much. And if I am invited on CNN or Fox, I'm talking about the Kurds, or I'm talking about something in history, or I'm talking about the faith of George W. Bush or something like that, because I wrote a book on that, as you well know. But what I do is I try not to take cameras with me. I don't have anybody watching. I make sure we don't. In fact, many times we don't even choose to have a little, hey, can we take a picture real quick? I don't even ask that. I don't want them to think I got some newsletter I'm going to brag about time with them. I want it to be completely hidden. And that you can't believe what that means to them, because almost all of them have been abused by some guy going in there with some reverend or doctor or something in front of his name, and he's going to air this thing for 900 years and hurt them. And there's a lot of history in that in American politics.
It's interesting because I'm running through all the experiences I recall in that exact scenario where someone goes up for some event, and it's a little story about, I got to meet the president. I shook his hand, and next time we talked for a minute. It just continues to grow.
Well, even good people have been played.
Oh, yeah.
And for example, the famous story is the first time Billy Graham ever met a president.
Bless his heart.
It was Truman. He went in there and he had a sincere moment. He prayed with him, and then he went out on the lawn. He was a young Southern preacher.
What did you talk about?
The press said, "Well, what?" They were playing it. What did you talk about? How did it go? So you prayed with him. Can you reenact that for us? Well, sure, I'd be delighted. He's thinking I'm ready to show the whole country prayer. Truman he looked like a fool. He was lit. Now, to his credit, Billy Graham apologized and never did it again. But this is the history of these things, and every official in D.C. knows that and is nervous. And I usually try to show up alone. They actually chide me, "Where's your entourage?" Well, I left them at home, if I even have one. I try to show up just alone. Hey, I'm going to be coming by myself. If you need anything else, let me know. Because I really want the conversation to be the focus and not the big PR bust afterwards.
So you're dealing with so many things between church and state. Any president is going to take some are going to take more heat than others when they are out about their faith. Trump, his first term, had quite a interesting, colorful entourage of emails and photographers around him. And some of those characters would go, ooh, I wish they wouldn't call themselves Christians.
Right.
And now we don't see that as much.
I think Trump realized that if he's going to listen to those people, the Paula Whites and so on, I don't mind saying the name, that he needs to do it in private. But these big office gaggles with all of them gathered around laying hands on him, I think that's actually hurt him and made him look like the pawn of some rather questionable people.
Or maybe from the television standpoint, he thought he looked good having all these.
I'm sure that is what he thought at first. And then I think he realized how foolish it made him look. Again, I've had people pray for me all the time. Sometimes they lay hands on me when they pray for me, but it's never on camera. And so I think a president should do most of that stuff in private.
It's such an interesting world between the isolation of being a leader like that, not unlike a pastor.
Right.
And yet your persona, everything you do and say is parsed and nuanced to the nth degree. Was it Truman that said Washington, D.C. is the kind of town, if you want a friend, you better buy a dog?
Get a dog, yeah, that's right.
And so you have that appreciation for the office. We don't have a king. We have a different form of government.
That's right.
We hope. And yet, as a believer in Jesus Christ, and this has been one of my tensions since we lived there to this day, is how do you live as a believer in Jesus Christ in a self-promoting world? Because you have to promote your agenda.
Right.
You can say we the people all day long, but it's the Trump administration, it's the Biden administration, it's the Reagan administration. And there's this tension of how you lead. That's why politics, I think, hits people with such a shrill, sharp edge.
But, sometimes we're going to be more powerful if we'll go counter the prevailing culture. And talk softly, carry a big stick, it still works, right? Be effective, be powerful, but don't be chest thumping.
There you go again.
I think our society is weary of it. So one of the things that often can lead to power is if you watch the prevailing style in our society and go opposite it, which is, by the way, what we're meant to do as Christians anyway, walk in the opposite spirit. And I see that working. I see that working. One of the guys you and I really admire is Mike Pence. And he's paid a dear price for his stance. But he's been right. And by the way, he was the hero of Jan 6. And I think that...
he was the hero of January 6th for integrity.
Yes.
But the element of conservatives that despise him...
They hate him. Well, he couldn't even qualify for some of the debates when he ran for president. I admire him deeply. I think he's an American hero. I hope he's present in our politics for a long time. But here's a man of genuine integrity, not just vain self-promotion, who's taken hits for it. But that's the role he's meant to play. I'm sorry that he has to suffer like that, but that's the role God's given him.
And it's sort of like being a pastor. You're going to get beat up. I mean, if you go into pastor ministry, you are going to be bludgeoned and beat up. And if you don't understand that on the front end, you shouldn't, one of my professors, Howard Hendricks, used to say, you guys think you're going to make money in ministry? Go get your head examined.
Right.
If that's your motivation, go be an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, but don't go into ministry. And he would often say there's lots of jobs, few ministries.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think politics is even more challenging for a believer, but yet don't we want Christians in the political landscape?
Yeah, we do want Christians in political landscape, but we don't want them to have what's been called for generations Potomac fever.
Oh, yeah.
Get to D.C., get the big head. I've been invited in the Oval Office by the president. It's big stuff. Yep. You walk around going, do I look any different? Because I sure feel bigger. And yet you just realize you're just drinking from some Kool-Aid here that's going to damage your life. And eventually I learned, calm down, Stephen. It's just a human being. God's put you in this role. You won't be in that role again if you ruin your spiritual life because you happen to have a few moments with the president. And you know what I mean? Seriously, if that taints your entire life, he'll take you out of that role. The question I think we ought to be asking ourselves is, we desperately need Christians speaking to power in quiet, confident, anointed ways. But if we go in and lose our minds the moment we get close to the little boxes of M&Ms in the White House or something like that, he'll not be able to use us anymore. And that's part of the problem. I don't think there are too many Christians in D.C. doing what I do and doing what you've done. I think there are too few because God can't trust people
I agree
not
with you on
to
that
blow
point.
up their lives when they have 5 minutes with somebody famous.
It's like wealth and success.
Exactly.
You find very few believers who are extremely successful, extremely wealthy, extremely powerful because they can't handle it.
Well, and I want to compliment you, not just because it's your podcast, because I admire you so much. I know when you've gotten some calls from immensely famous people. We are not going to mention them on the air. I know you're in regular conversation with these people. And I've been your friend for what? 15 years, heading longer, hopefully for another 25. You've never mentioned it. Unless I just sat on your chest and said, tell me, or I had to ask you a question.
Well, you're the same way. You protect your client list.
I don't tell anybody. I don't tell anybody.
I mean, we might have a, hey, I know so-and-so conversation about a friend, but it's not like, hey.
Right. Well, I found out when the famous guy told me, right? Follow. That's how I want you to find out. Yeah, I was talking to whoever famous, and he happened to mention you, Stephen. It's not about famous, not famous. It's about, can we be trusted with the responsibility?
And from a ministry lens, when I lived there, of course, I knew nothing when we went from Texas to Northern Virginia. I knew nothing about politics. I didn't even care about politics.
Yeah,
and I started getting to know these people, and there was a wise woman at the church where we served, and she told me one time, she said, you're going to minister to people who are the most powerful people on the planet. Mm-hmm. How are you going to handle that? And I was like, well, I had never thought of it in that way. Yeah. And she was very kind to me. She was older, but a mentor in a way, but that statement still sticks with me today.
Yeah.
And that was when I said, I just want to know who they are and how to love them and pray for them and encourage them. And one of the first times I was, in some of these offices, I'm just blown away by the people who made a choice of serving.
Yes.
And I get to see where they work, and I go, he's a believer in Christ first, and he happened to go to West Point, or he ran for Congress or whatever, and this is where he is today. That is so fascinating.
Yeah, and Michael, there's another thing as a pastor in D.C., and that is, and this is what really moves me, is when I'm alone with some of these people, you can't believe how they are no different from Kmart America. Their daughter's dating the wrong guy. Their son's messing with drugs. They've had a fight with their wife the previous day. They're gaining weight, whatever it might be. Not
to mention, they've relocated to a crazy city from what was home.
They're removed from their spouse, and the third girl in the typing pool is looking great. I mean, we all know what's going on. And I've had them weep in my arms out of things that most people don't think would even bedevil these folks. Loneliness, a deep sense of insecurity. I'm worthless. I shouldn't even be in this role. Yeah. On and on. My point is that I hurt for them. It's not that I want to be with them because they're famous. Frankly, it's a pain. It's a pain. It's like I joke all the time. I've got one really famous friend in Nashville, and I hate going to lunch with him because we can't get a bite without saying, "Hey, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt." I want to say, "You lie." But my point is
then don't.
That if people like you and I and others who are called to this can't be trusted with the lives of the famous, then these people suffer and hurt even more. Yeah. And I think the body of Christ can even end up being responsible for the explosions that are happening in lives in D.C.
Remember the times I went to meet a new congressman usually, and you could read it. What do you want from me?
Right.
And I don't want anything. I just want to see how you're doing and pray for you and welcome to the town.
Well, I actually, you probably handled that a little bit more with character. I don't want a damn thing. I actually been trying to bust a little bit of the religious groove. Did you think I wanted another fellowship hall in my building? What is it you think? I don't want a damn thing. I'll say it just like that.
What's fascinating,
this is not your usual guy.
When they're out and you send them an email, or I was thinking about you text, they're like delighted.
Yes.
You remembered them.
Yes.
Because they're no longer this celebrity on the news hits, or in demand for something. They're just a person that used to be in Congress or used to be in the Senate, and they're people. You're right. They're just human beings.
They're just human beings. And by the way, as you've just said, very important point for your audience to hear, the stunning pressure they are under
never stops.
We know that there are organizations that troll to capture people in Congress morally. We know. Prostitutes are hired. People are put into jobs who are especially well built and going after the male or the female leader. We know that there are conspiracies against them, natural human conspiracies, not to mention whatever's going on in the spirit. And so we've just got to be there. That's all there is to it.
A congressman that we knew pretty well, very well, when he was he lived in D.C. after he'd served a number of years, and his mission was he and his wife to reach out to these incoming couples and say, you must move to D.C. Get an apartment, something.
Absolutely.
But you do not leave the family back in Kansas or Texas or wherever. You come and you find a church and you find some friends, because you cannot do this being separated. Steve Largent spoke publicly many times about getting up at 4 a.m, flying to D.C., flying home, the toll it took on his family. And a lot of those guys, they don't stay in it for that reason.
Well, and there are practical things they can learn to do. For example, a former House Minority Leader made sure his wife was sitting there every time anybody was hired. Because what happens, as you well know, is you get an insider-outsider thing. The wife's kind of the enemy invading the staff and kind of resented and kept at a distance. So everybody he hired, he had her sitting right there, and they understood. He also kept 2 cell phones. One for his daughter alone. Only she had the number. He only had one daughter. So in high school, she was able to get her dad, even though he was, running the world. On and on. There are practical things they could do, and of course, and then one thing is the rotation in the districts, having a place in D.C., all of that kind of thing, and don't be doing the late nights up at the Capitol. That's where a lot of stuff goes amok.
Now we've moved from talking about the Episcopal Church owning to the individual lives of men and women in office, and I guess I want to come back to more thoughts on encouraging younger people. Maybe God's wired them for public service. Maybe God's wired them to go work a campaign to see what it's like. I mean, how would you speak to a younger person who says, I don't know what I want to do, but I'm kind of interested in politics, but boy, it seems crazy?
It is crazy. And what industry doesn't look like it from the outside? You're going to make sausages? You're going to work for Apple? What industry? It is a little crazy. But it is, first of all, just at a human level, it's very exciting. But it's also where you can make a huge difference. I've been sitting in congressional offices where the high school intern changes a policy that's voted on the floor within a couple of days. Where else do you have that kind of influence? Where else does the best rise? And so the potential's huge, and it's worth the pain. By the way, politics is a very diverse thing. Where you and I are talking about D.C. politics. There's diplomatic politics. There's local politics. There's county politics. All kinds of places to get involved. But I think it's worth the pain. I think, and by the way, if it's the calling of God, you ain't got a choice. Get in there and get the job done.
So, final remarks on going forward. How do we extrapolate our national events, our national political events, from the Episcopal Church control?
Either the federal government negotiates use of the building exclusive of the Episcopal Church.
Which probably couldn't happen.
It could if the Episcopalians allow it.
Okay.
We will yield up the building. We want to have approval of whatever the ceremony is, so you're not handling rattlesnakes or whatever goofy thing. Of course, that's all joking. And you can have the building for those 2 hours, and then we take it back. That's done all the time. Basically, the denomination abandons its building and turns it over to whomever with certain constraints. That's one possibility. Or you just start having it somewhere else. You just start having it. Now, that would sadden me, I have to tell you, because I love these two churches.
It's beautiful.
I love them. They have great history. But something's got to change here. We cannot be having our federal, our national religious moments conditioned by one of the most extreme denominations on the planet that, by the way, is approximately the size of the population of Nashville worldwide. Come on.
On a healthy Sunday.
Yeah, on a healthy Sunday. That's when the Opry's on. Oh, my gosh.
Stephen Mansfield, thanks again for coming on the program.
Great to be with you.
And as always, we have information about our guest in the show notes. So if you have any further questions about Stephen, you can follow him on social media, on his website. He's got all kinds of great resources. And check out some of his books. You'll be a better person for it.